Hello, my name is Chris, and I would like to teach you how to play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Circa 2025. This video, along with other videos that I might make alongside this one, are aimed at giving people a resource that actually walks them through how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played nowadays. This video was originally intended for a friend of mine who plays Magic the Gathering, so you may hear me reference that from time to time in comparison to Yu-Gi-Oh! This video is mostly going to focus on what draws people to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, how cards are designed and balanced, and how to read a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card. And when I say read a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, I don't just mean the info on the borders like attribute or attack. I mean literally reading what's in the text box. To go on a small tangent, one of the most exciting and daunting things about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is its willingness to break its own rules in order to produce interesting cards with original effects. For instance, you're only supposed to get one normal summon, but what if we made a deck that did it 6 times? What if we made a card that put the monsters where the spells are supposed to go? What if we allowed you to cheat out monsters you're not supposed to? What happens then? The issue is, this constant breaking and restructuring of its own rules means that it's near impossible to understand how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! From a base understanding of the rule set. The key to understanding a card game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is understanding how it balances and restricts itself. In my opinion, knowing how the cards work takes first priority over anything else. This goes for most card games, not just Yu-Gi-Oh! So let's get started. So, looking at any given Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, there is a lot to go over. Spells and traps are relatively simple. You have the card's name and the type of spell or trap the card is. With monsters, there is significantly more to analyze. You have the card's name, its attribute, its level, its subtype, its card types, its attack, and its defense. Now, I want you to conceptualize all of these factors not as individual values on the card, but as interconnected conditions and restrictions that need to be taken into account when playing the game. Everything that I just talked about, from the card's defense to its name, are all restrictions on what you are allowed to do with the card. What do I mean by this? Well, let's look at a card like Reinforcement of the Army, for example. Reinforcement of the Army, also known as Rhoda, is a spell card that says, add one level 4 or lower warrior monster from your deck to your hand. Fun fact, often a card that searches your deck for a monster that's integral to your game plan is referred to as a Rhoda. It's not important to learning the game, it's just a fun bit of trivia. A lot of the time, when you look at modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, it looks like people are just adding every single card to their deck to their hand with no restrictions. And while the game is like that, there's really no such thing as a generic tutor in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like there is in Magic. In Magic, you're restricted by your energy system, along with other games like Pokemon and the like, Hearthstone. You need a certain number of mana or energy, and you need it in specific colors, in Magic's case, in order to activate cards, and even then, there might be additional costs tacked on. Yu-Gi-Oh! Trades an energy system in favor of piling on more restrictions on the cards you play. This, in my opinion, is half the reason Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are so long. So much of the text of what a card does is buried in the conditions and restrictions of how you can use that card. Let's look at another example. Armed Dragon Flash. Armed Dragon Flash says, special summon one level 3 armed dragon monster from your deck in defense position. You can only activate one armed dragon flash per turn. Now, I picked this card as an example because I think it shows two major factors of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypal restrictions and once per turn effects. Arguably, these are the two pillars on which modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Stands. Everything down to the name affects how cards interact with each other. and the only reason this card is allowed to have a seemingly very powerful effect is because the card pool it searches is limited to these 3 cards. As I was writing this, a 4th came out, so these 4 cards. Conversely, Reinforcement of the Army has a card pool of almost 600. That's why Rhoda is limited to 1 copy per deck, and Armed Dragon Flash isn't. Also because the card's Armed Dragon Flash searches are bad, but that's beside the point. The card pool Rhoda can search from is nothing compared to the 13,000 other cards that exist in the game. The point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that the more specific that a card is, the stronger it's allowed to be. Certain decks are allowed to do insanely broken things as long as they are the only ones able to do so. This gives some insight into how the ban list of Yu-Gi-Oh works, which is a topic for discussion at another point, but just know, generally generic powerful cards take priority in being banned over very specific tools that only 1 or 2 decks might have access to. The other part of this card that I wanted to detail is the once per turn restriction on it. That doesn't just apply to that card, it applies to all copies of that card in your deck. Many cards will have some form of a once per turn restriction or OPT on them, and this limits the repeatability of the cards in your deck. If your opponent prevents you from making certain plays, you'll have to wait until your next turn to make them again, provided your opponent doesn't kill you first. Running multiple copies of certain cards in your deck can be a liability because drawing additional copies of those cards don't provide you additional benefits in the same way as they would in other games, and depending on the situation, they may not even be that valuable in your hand. They're typically referred to as bricks, which is something that will be gone over in another video about deck building. What I'm trying to explain is this. Yes, Yu-Gi-Oh decks are able to make insane, powerful plays all in 1 turn, but with the correct interaction at the right time, it is very easy to force someone to pivot to a less powerful option or even force them to end their turn on nothing valuable at all, which is very reminiscent of situations that have come up in the original anime. All of this that I've talked about so far has been about what conceptually makes Yu-Gi-Oh balanced, but I think we should read a card together to understand the sentence structure of Yu-Gi-Oh cards and how they work. This is Effect Veiler. Its text reads, during your opponent's main phase, quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, GY meaning graveyard, then target 1 effect monster your opponent controls, negate the effect of that face-up monster your opponent controls until the end of this turn. The reason that the card is formatted this way goes a little deeper into the way that Yu-Gi-Oh cards are written, and goes back to my original point about conditions and restrictions as well. Just a warning, this is where Yu-Gi-Oh actually gets complicated. Okay, see that? That is a colon. Everything that comes before the colon are the conditions that need to be met before the card can be activated. In this case, this card can only be activated during your opponent's main phase. The quick effect in the parentheses is just there to note that the card can be used at instant speed, usually on either player's turn. However, the condition before it locks you into only being able to use it during the opponent's main phase. Then we have the semicolon. Anything that comes between the colon and the semicolon is considered the cost for activating the card or designating the target for the card if it has any. In this case, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, then target 1 effect monster your opponent controls. At this point, your opponent is given an opportunity to respond before the card resolves, and the period at the end of the sentence denotes what happens when the effect resolves. In this case, negate the effects of that face-up monster your opponent controls until the end of this turn. Almost all card effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are broken down into these three parts: condition, cost, and effect. Some cards won't have conditions for activating them or costs, in which case all you need to do is declare you are using the card or effect. Then your opponent gets a chance to respond before it resolves. What I just explained is the basics of the text structure that is used to design all Yu-Gi-Oh cards from 2012 onward, called Problem Solving Card Text, or PSCT, which I will not be going over. It will not happen. Not anytime soon. You can't make me. PSCT is basically that one Magic the Gathering meme of reading the card explains the card, but Konami thinks we're stupid, so every card is an English paper on why the card works like it's supposed to. It was designed with the intent that any and all rulings interactions could be figured out by just reading the cards, but here we are. This is the other reason why Yu-Gi-Oh cards are so long. Realistically, with this system, every Yu-Gi-Oh player should be an English major, but somehow we went into the opposite direction. My theory is that it was just out of pure spite. But I'm getting sidetracked. Yu-Gi-Oh is a complicated game that really has no parallels to any other card game, which is really funny considering it has its roots in being a Magic the Gathering ripoff. In other card games, building a deck is like preparing a recipe. You gather a bunch of ingredients together and you create something that is more than the sum of its parts, and you can kind of gauge what you are making based on the ingredients you have. Yu-Gi-Oh is not like this. Yu-Gi-Oh is more like constructing code for a program or putting together a jigsaw puzzle. No singular line of code tells you what a program is made to do. No singular puzzle piece tells you what the full picture looks like. And no singular Yu-Gi-Oh card tells you what a deck is trying to accomplish. It is only by connecting cards to those that look closest to it, and by putting those cards in a specific order, that you will then understand how a deck works. Today, Yu-Gi-Oh decks are judged by their end boards. What is a deck capable of doing when it's given free range to do whatever it wants? Which is another reason why being a casual observer of Yu-Gi-Oh can be so difficult. Rather than looking at the start of a turn and trying to figure out where things are going as the game is being played, it is more valuable to look at the end result and work backwards from there in order to understand what it is a player is trying to accomplish. Kind of like looking at the box of a puzzle to see the finished picture before you start putting the pieces together. Additionally, the explosive power of decks means there is an added pressure to the player to constantly be aware of what it is your opponent is trying to do, to get inside their head and analyze their plays, to bait them into making mistakes and punishing them accordingly. I'm not saying that other games don't have this dynamic, but the sheer amount of actions per game means that you need to be that much more aware and selective about what you do. Yu-Gi-Oh is full of these types of mind games and surprising moments, and in that sense, I don't think that vibe and core conceit of Yu-Gi-Oh has changed much from the original show that we all loved at some point and still do now. I also wanted to include this quote from a YouTuber known as The Drock Show, who has a very interesting video about trying to convince people why Yu-Gi-Oh is cool, more from a sort of meta-narrative perspective in relation to its original Magic the Gathering roots that it was based off of. It goes like this. Because it's not about the building of power to act upon a fantasy. It is about the fantasy of playing a game at its highest level, of playing a game when you have all your mana. Yu-Gi-Oh, because it was made to be a love letter to why you love Magic the Gathering, starts at the last step of Magic the Gathering. It starts fundamentally at the point where you have all your game pieces, where you're able to move them the way that you want, where you are able to play. The meta narrative of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is playing the game. Thank you for watching and listening. If this video helped you out in any way, make sure to tell me about it below. I definitely want to make more of these, and I will be starting on a few topics. So if you're interested, like and subscribe.